The road trip to Celebration. It was the kind of day families remember forever. A road trip meant to mark a milestone. Jason Carter sat behind the wheel of the family's rented SUV, his hand steady, his face calm. His wife, Natalie, hummed along to a cheerful tune playing on her phone, while their teenage children, Brianna and Alex, chatted excitedly in the back seat. This wasn't just any trip. Brianna, their eldest, had recently been accepted into Stanford University, a dream she'd worked tirelessly for since she was 12. The family was on their way from Austin, Texas, to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to celebrate with extended family and friends. It was supposed to be a relaxing journey, a chance to bask in Brianna's success and enjoy some much-needed family time. Jason, a man in his mid-40s, was known for his steady presence. His job, shrouded in secrecy, had always required him to stay calm under pressure. To his family, he was just Dad, a man who worked for the government in some vague capacity. Today, he left his work behind to focus on his role as a father. The scenic detour Jason had insisted on, winding roads flanked by golden deserts and towering mesas, had been breathtaking. It was one of those rare, perfect moments when everything felt just right. The air was warm, the sky a deep blue, and laughter filled the car. But then, as the family passed through a small, dusty town, everything changed. A patrol car appeared in the rearview mirror, its red and blue lights flashing insistently. "What's going on?" Natalie asked, her voice tight. Jason glanced at her and then at the kids in the backseat. "I don't know. Stay calm." Jason slowed the SUV and pulled over to the gravel shoulder. The patrol car stopped behind them, its flashing lights painting the desert in jolts of color. Jason adjusted his rearview mirror, watching as two officers emerged. One was stocky with a furrowed brow and mirrored sunglasses. The other, younger and tall, carried attention in his stride. "Kids, stay quiet," Jason said softly, his tone firm but reassuring. He reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate. Natalie's hand instinctively found Brianna's, offering silent comfort. The older officer approached Jason's window. "License and registration," he barked, his tone clipped. Jason handed over the documents without a word, keeping his movements slow and measured. The officer scanned the papers briefly before fixing his gaze on Jason. "Where are you headed?" "To Santa Fe," Jason replied evenly. "Family trip." The younger officer circled to the passenger side, peering into the car. His eyes lingered on Alex and Brianna in the back seat. "What's in the car?" he asked, his tone suspicious. Jason's jaw tightened. "Just our luggage. Clothes, snacks, normal road trip stuff." The older officer's lip curled slightly. "Mind if we take a look?" Jason hesitated. "Officer, is there a problem?" "Just routine." The younger officer cut in. "You seem out of place." The weight of those words hung heavily in the air. Natalie shifted uncomfortably, her expression tense. Brianna and Alex exchanged nervous glances. Jason took a deep breath. "We're just passing through. Everything's in order." The older officer straightened, his hand resting on his belt near his gun. "Step out of the car. All of you." "For what reason?" Natalie's voice quivered slightly, but there was strength in her eyes. "Ma'am," the younger officer snapped. "Step out now." Jason nodded to Natalie. "Let's not escalate. Just do as they say." He turned to the kids. "Stay close to your mom." The family exited the car, the warm desert air wrapping around them. The officers began searching the SUV, tossing aside the neatly packed luggage with little regard. Jason stood still, his hands visible, his mind racing but his face unreadable. "Dad, what's going on?" Brianna whispered. Jason's reply was soft but firm. "Stay calm. Stay close." The search grew more aggressive. Brianna's textbooks were tossed aside, and Natalie's carefully packed toiletries spilled onto the gravel. Brianna's face turned red with anger, but she remained silent, her father's calm demeanor anchoring her. "This isn't right," Natalie muttered, her voice laced with frustration. Jason didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the officers, watching their every move. His instincts, honed over years of training, told him this was more than a routine stop. The older officer turned to Jason, his expression hard. "We're not getting the answers we're looking for." Jason's patience thinned. "I've given you everything you need. We're just a family on a road trip." The younger officer smirked. "Passing through. From Austin to Santa Fe. You don't belong here." Natalie stepped forward, her anger bubbling to the surface. "This is harassment. We've done nothing wrong." "Ma'am, step back," the older officer barked, his hand now resting fully on his holster. Jason's calm exterior cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake." The younger officer ignored him, moving toward Brianna. "Let's see some ID," he demanded. Brianna recoiled slightly, her mother stepping protectively in front of her. Jason placed a hand on Natalie's arm, signaling her to let him handle it. "Officer," Jason said, his voice steady but commanding, "there's no reason to involve my children." The tension reached a boiling point when Alex, visibly shaking, pulled out his phone. "I'm recording this," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "What are you doing with that phone?" The older officer growled, stepping closer. "I have the right to record," Alex said, holding the phone up. The younger officer lunged, grabbing Alex's wrist. "Hand it over." "Let him go." Jason's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and firm. The phone fell to the ground, shattering on impact. Alex cried out, his voice filled with a mix of fear and defiance. Brianna clutched her mother's arm, her eyes wide with shock. Jason's calm demeanor shattered entirely. He stepped forward, placing himself between the officer and his son. "Enough." His voice, though not loud, carried the weight of authority. The older officer sneered. "And what are you going to do about it?" Jason reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately. The younger officer tensed, his hand hovering near his weapon. "What are you doing?" the officer demanded. Jason pulled out a slim black wallet, flipping it open. A gold badge glinted in the sunlight, its engraved letters unmistakable. Central Intelligence Agency. Both officers froze, their smug expressions replaced with shock. "This stops now," Jason said, his voice low and deadly serious. A detour into danger. The Carter's SUV rolled along the winding back roads, the family trying to recapture the joy of the trip after the initial tension caused by the detour. Jason had chosen the scenic route to escape the monotony of the interstate, promising breathtaking views of New Mexico's golden deserts and iconic mesas. His plan had worked, until now. Natalie sat in the passenger seat, flipping through playlists on her phone, her brows furrowed. She noticed Jason's quiet demeanor and reached over, resting a hand on his arm. "You sure about this route, Jason?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with unease. Jason glanced at her, his smile reassuring. "It's fine. A little off the beaten path, but it's nothing we haven't handled before." In the back seat, Brianna leaned against the window, scrolling through her phone. She'd been unusually quiet, her excitement about her Stanford acceptance dimmed by the unsettling stop earlier. Beside her, Alex fidgeted, his earbuds in, pretending to listen to music, but stealing glances at his parents. "Why don't we play something everyone likes?" Natalie suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Brianna sighed but shrugged. "Sure, as long as Alex doesn't pick one of his awful playlists." Alex pulled out an earbud. "My music isn't awful. It's eclectic." Before the light-hearted banter could continue, Jason's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. A patrol car had appeared again, trailing them at a steady distance. Natalie followed his gaze. "Is that the same car?" Jason didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, and his mind raced. Could it be the same officers? Had they been followed? "Stay calm," he said finally, his voice firm but low. We don't know anything yet. Brianna and Alex exchanged uneasy glances. Is something wrong? Brianna asked, her voice tinged with worry. Jason shook his head, though his focus never left the rearview mirror. Probably nothing. Just routine. But as the patrol car accelerated, closing the distance, Jason's instincts told him this was anything but routine. He had spent years learning to trust those instincts, and they rarely failed him. The patrol car's lights flashed, red and blue slicing through the tranquility of the desert. Jason sighed heavily, pulling the SUV to the shoulder of the road once again. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, the sound oddly loud in the tense silence. Not again, Natalie muttered, her voice a mix of frustration and fear. She turned to the kids. Stay calm, okay? Don't say anything unless you have to. Jason adjusted his rearview mirror, watching as the same two officers from earlier stepped out of the patrol car. His mind raced, analyzing every possible outcome. These men weren't here by chance. They have followed them for a reason. And that reason likely had little to do with any legitimate law enforcement concern. Kids, Jason said softly, his voice calm but commanding. Stay quiet. Let me handle this. The officers approached, their expressions cold and calculating. The older one, stocky and smug, leaned into Jason's window again. His mirrored sunglasses reflected Jason's own face back at him, obscuring any hint of emotion. We meet again, the officer said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Mind stepping out of the vehicle. Jason kept his composure. Is there a reason for this, officer? You've already seen our documents. We're just passing through. The younger officer, who had circled to the passenger side, knocked on Natalie's window. Ma'am, you too. Everyone out. Now. Natalie shot Jason a worried glance. He nodded subtly, his expression unreadable but calm. Do what they say, he murmured. As the family exited the vehicle, the tension in the air thickened. The officers wasted no time, ordering them to line up by the side of the road. The sun beat down on them, the desert heat adding to the discomfort of the moment. This is harassment, Natalie said, her voice low but firm. We've done nothing wrong. The older officer smirked, his hand resting on his belt. We'll be the judge of that. Jason's mind worked furiously. His training told him this was more than just a power trip. There was intent behind their actions, something that went beyond the typical abuse of authority. He needed to defuse the situation before it escalated further. The younger officer began searching the SUV, rifling through their belongings with little care. He pulled out Alex's backpack, dumping its contents onto the ground. Books, headphones, and snacks scattered across the gravel. Hey! Alex protested, stepping forward instinctively. Alex, Jason said sharply, his tone halting his son in his tracks. Stay put. Brianna clutched her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear. Dad, this isn't right. Jason turned to the officers, his voice steady but firm. You've already searched our car. What exactly are you looking for? The older officer sneered. Just doing our job. You got a problem with that? Jason met his gaze evenly. I do, actually. You're overstepping your authority. The officer took a step closer, his demeanor menacing. Is that so? Before Jason could respond, Alex pulled out his phone. I'm recording this, he said, his voice trembling but determined. You can't do this to us. The older officer's face darkened. Hand over the phone, kid. No. Alex shot back, his grip on the phone tightening. You don't have the right. The officer lunged, grabbing Alex by the arm. Natalie cried out, rushing to her son's side, but the younger officer intercepted her, blocking her path. Let him go. Jason's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. The older officer froze, his grip on Alex loosening momentarily. Jason stepped forward, his calm facade cracking. That's enough, he said, his voice low but laced with authority. The younger officer reached for his weapon, his hand hovering near his holster. Stay back. Jason raised his hand slowly, his movements deliberate. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone measured but firm. The older officer scoffed. "You think you're in a position to make threats." Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. The officers tensed, their hands moving to their weapons. "Easy," Jason said, his voice steady. "I'm just grabbing my ID." He pulled out a slim black wallet, flipping it open to reveal his CIA badge. The gold emblem caught the sunlight, the words Central Intelligence Agency clearly visible. Both officers froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. The younger one took a step back, his face pale. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move," Jason said, his voice cold and unyielding. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their mistake sinking in. But Jason wasn't finished. This wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. It was about holding these men accountable. The line is crossed. Jason Carter stood motionless, his body a picture of calm control as the two officers continued their aggressive search of the SUV. Behind him, Natalie clutched her children tightly, her eyes darting between her husband and the officers. Alex's face burned with barely concealed rage, while Brianna fought back tears, her shoulders tense as she tried to appear braver than she felt. Jason's years of experience in high-pressure situations had taught him that patience could often disarm even the most volatile situations. But patience was wearing thin. Every calculated insult, every deliberately tossed bag, every smug glance from the officers, each action felt like a tightening screw. "I don't understand why this is happening," Natalie whispered, her voice low but trembling with anger. Jason turned slightly, meeting her gaze. "It's about control," he said, his tone measured. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." The younger officer yanked open another bag, rummaging through its contents with exaggerated motions. He pulled out one of Brianna's notebooks, flipping through it lazily before tossing it onto the ground. "That's mine," Brianna exclaimed, stepping forward instinctively. "Brianna, stop." Natalie pulled her daughter back, her voice urgent. The older officer smirked, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses. "Feisty, huh? You better keep her in line, mister." Jason's expression darkened, but his voice remained steady. "Watch your tone." The officer laughed mockingly, stepping closer to Jason. "Or what?" Jason didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto the officers. "You don't want to find out." The tension between them was electric, a silent standoff that felt like it could explode at any moment. The younger officer broke the silence, his voice sharp. "You're awfully confident for someone with a family to protect." Jason's jaw tightened. "Because I know the law." "Do you?" The younger officer bristled, stepping back toward the SUV. "Let's see what else you're hiding." Brianna clung to her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't fair, Mom. We didn't do anything." Natalie wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, her own anger bubbling just below the surface. "I know, sweetheart, but your father has this under control." Jason's mind raced, calculating the best course of action. The situation was spiraling, but he couldn't afford to lose his temper. Not yet. He needed the officers to dig their own grave, to push so far that there would be no question of their misconduct. The older officer's radio crackled, interrupting the tense silence. He stepped away, muttering something into the device. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. "We've got a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his tone suddenly formal. "We'll need to detain you until we clear this up." Jason's eyebrows lifted slightly, his skepticism clear. "Suspicious activity. Convenient." "Step aside," the younger officer barked, motioning for Jason to move. "We're taking this vehicle in for further inspection." "You're not taking anything," Jason replied calmly, but firmly. His voice carried the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. The older officer sneered. "You don't have a choice." Jason took a deliberate step forward, his body language shifting from passive to commanding. Actually, I do. Behind him, Alex suddenly stepped forward, his phone in hand. I'm recording this, he said loudly, his voice shaky but determined. Everyone's going to see what you're doing. The younger officer turned sharply, his hand darting toward his belt. Put that down. No, Alex shouted, holding the phone up higher. You can't stop me. The older officer lunged, grabbing Alex by the arm and twisting it roughly. Alex cried out in pain, the phone slipping from his grip and clattering to the ground. Natalie screamed, rushing toward her son, but the younger officer blocked her path. Let him go, she yelled, her voice shaking with fury. Jason's calm exterior finally cracked. Enough, he thundered, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. The older officer froze, startled by the sudden shift in Jason's demeanor. Slowly, Jason moved forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Step away from my son, he said, his tone low but deadly serious. The younger officer hesitated, his confidence faltering. Stay where you are, he said, his voice wavering slightly. Jason ignored him, taking another step closer. You've crossed a line, he said, his voice steady and unwavering. Release him. Now, the older officer's grip loosened slightly, his face betraying a flicker of doubt. Or what? Jason's eyes narrowed. Or you'll regret it. The officer's arrogance wavered, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching tires filled the air. A black SUV pulled up behind a patrol car, its tinted windows reflecting the desert sun. The doors opened, and two sharply dressed men stepped out, their movements crisp and deliberate. Jason allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Reinforcements. Who the hell are they? The older officer demanded, his bravado faltering. Jason turned to face the newcomers, his expression unreadable. Back up, he said simply. The taller of the two men approached, his presence commanding. He held up a badge, flashing it briefly before slipping it back into his pocket. Special Agent Collins, Department of Internal Affairs, he said, his voice cool and professional. We've been monitoring this situation. The officers exchanged panicked glances, their earlier confidence crumbling. What's going on here? The younger officer stammered. Agent Collins didn't bother answering. Instead, he turned to Jason. Mr. Carter, are you and your family all right? Jason nodded. We're fine, but these officers have a lot to answer for. Collins nodded, turning back to the officers. You're done here. Turn in your badges and weapons. Now. The older officer's face turned red with anger. You can't do this. I can, Collins replied calmly. And I just did. As the officers reluctantly complied, Jason stepped back, his body relaxing for the first time in hours. Natalie rushed to Alex, pulling him into a tight embrace, while Brianna clung to her father, tears streaming down her face. It's over, Jason said softly, wrapping an arm around his daughter. We're safe. But as the family regrouped, Jason's mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about his family anymore. The system that had enabled these officers to abuse their power needed to be held accountable. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Unmasking the truth, the SUV was silent as the Carters drove away from the confrontation with the officers, their bags messily tossed back into the trunk. Jason's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Natalie sat beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mixture of frustration and concern. Brianna and Alex sat in the back, still shaken, their voices muted as they tried to process what had just happened. They were wrong, Dad, Alex finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was tinged with anger. They had no right to treat us like that. Jason glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. You're right, Alex. They didn't. Then why did you let them get away with it? Alex pressed, his frustration boiling over. Why didn't you do something? Jason sighed heavily. I did what I had to do to keep all of you safe. Brianna, who had been staring out the window, turned to her father. "But they destroyed Alex's phone, threw our stuff around, and humiliated us. They need to pay for this." "They will," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "But there's a right way to handle these things." Natalie finally spoke, her voice soft but determined. "Jason, they followed us. This wasn't just a random stop. They were targeting us." "Why? Do you think they knew who you are?" Jason shook his head. "I don't think they knew at first. If they had, they wouldn't have acted that way. But once they realized I wasn't just some random guy, they doubled down to try and assert control." Brianna frowned. "But why would they do that? It doesn't make sense." "It does to them," Jason said grimly. "It's about power. They thought they could intimidate us because they saw us as vulnerable." The car fell silent again as the family absorbed Jason's words. The desert scenery outside, once so beautiful and calming, now felt stark and unwelcoming. Later that evening, the Carters arrived at their hotel in Santa Fe. The celebratory mood that had been planned for Brianna's achievement was replaced with a tense, uneasy quiet. Jason checked them in, his demeanor professional and collected, but Natalie could see the strain in his posture. Once they were settled in their room, Jason called his agency contact. His voice was low as he relayed the events of the day, providing a detailed account of the officers' actions and their blatant abuse of power. While he spoke, Natalie unpacked their bags, her movements slow and deliberate. Brianna sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through social media in silence, while Alex stared at the pieces of his shattered phone. When Jason hung up, he turned to his family. "I've reported it," he said simply. "Internal Affairs is going to investigate." Natalie crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Is that enough? Those men shouldn't just be investigated. They should be fired." "They will be," Jason assured her. "But these things take time." "What if they try to cover it up?" Brianna asked, her voice laced with doubt. "What if nothing happens?" Jason sat down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's not going to happen, Brianna. I've made sure of it." "How?" Alex asked, his tone skeptical. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I didn't just report them to Internal Affairs. I also contacted the media." The room went still. Natalie's eyes widened. "Jason, are you sure that's a good idea?" Jason nodded. "This isn't just about us anymore. What happened to us today happens to countless other families who don't have the resources or connections to fight back. This story needs to be told." The following morning, Jason woke early and checked his phone. The video Alex had managed to capture before his phone was destroyed had already gone viral, thanks to the media contacts Jason had reached out to. Headlines were spreading across social media. "Family harassed by police. Father's CIA status turns the tables." When Natalie saw the news, her face was a mix of relief and apprehension. "Do you think this will make a difference?" she asked. "It already is," Jason replied, scrolling through the comments. "People are talking about it. They're angry, and when enough people demand accountability, things change." Brianna and Alex joined them, both looking tired but curious. "What are people saying?" Brianna asked. Jason handed her the phone. "See for yourself." Brianna scrolled through the comments, her eyes widening. "Dad, people are furious. They're sharing their own stories of being harassed by cops. This is huge." Alex leaned over her shoulder, reading the comments. "Looks like the department's getting slammed. Serves them right." Jason smiled faintly. "This isn't about revenge, Alex. It's about justice. Those officers need to be held accountable, and the system that allowed them to act that way needs to change." By midday, the media frenzy had reached a boiling point. News crews gathered outside the police department, demanding statements. The police chief issued a public apology, announcing that the two officers had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. But Jason knew that wasn't enough. He contacted his agency again, this time requesting access to legal resources and civil rights organizations that could help ensure the investigation was thorough and transparent. His position as a CIA agent gave him leverage, and he intended to use it. That evening, the Carters gathered in their hotel room, watching the news. The story had become a national headline, sparking debates about police misconduct and systemic racism. Jason felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that his family's ordeal was helping to shine a light on a larger issue. "This isn't over," he said, turning to his family. "But we've started something important, and we're not alone." Natalie reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You did the right thing, Jason." Brianna and Alex nodded in agreement, their faces filled with pride. For the first time in days, the tension began to lift. The Carters knew the fight for justice was far from over, but they also knew they had each other, and that was enough to keep them going. The battle for justice. The Carter family sat in their hotel room as the sun began to set over Santa Fe. The orange glow outside cast long shadows across the room, but the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Jason paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. His calm yet firm voice directed the conversation as he spoke to a journalist. "This isn't just about my family," Jason said. "It's about a pattern of behavior that's been allowed to persist. These officers didn't just target us. They've likely done this to others. We were fortunate enough to fight back, but not everyone has that privilege." Natalie, seated at the small dining table, watched her husband with a mixture of admiration and concern. Brianna and Alex sat on the bed, their expressions a blend of curiosity and apprehension. They had seen their father's calm, commanding side before, but this was different. He wasn't just their protector, he was becoming an advocate for justice. When Jason finally hung up, he turned to his family. "The journalist will publish the story tomorrow morning. It's going to include the video Alex recorded, along with witness statements from others in the area who saw what happened." "Witness statements?" Natalie asked, surprised. Jason nodded. Apparently, a few drivers who passed by the scene stopped at the police station afterward to report what they saw. Their accounts match ours. Alex's face lit up. "So, they're not getting away with this." "Not if I can help it," Jason replied. His tone was firm, but his expression softened as he looked at his son. "What you did, Alex, recording them, standing your ground, it made a difference." Alex shrugged, though his cheeks flushed with pride. "I just wanted them to stop." Jason smiled faintly. Sometimes, standing up in the moment is what sparks change. The next morning, the story broke across national media. Headlines like "CIA agent's family harassed by police," "A case of racial profiling," and "Roadside confrontation sparks national outrage" dominated news outlets. The video Alex had recorded, grainy but clear enough to capture the officer's behavior, became the centerpiece of the narrative. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags like #JusticeForTheCarters, #StopPoliceAbuse, and #AccountabilityNow trended worldwide. People shared their own experiences, creating a tidal wave of public outcry. Natalie sat beside Jason, scrolling through the comments on her phone. "People are furious," she said. "They're calling for those officers to be fired." Brianna leaned over her mother's shoulder. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a post. "I've been stopped in that same area before. They treated me the same way. Finally, someone's calling them out." Jason nodded. "This is why we had to do this. It's bigger than us now." Later that day, Jason received a call from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. The officer on the other end was polite but direct. "Mr. Carter, we're conducting a full investigation into the incident. We'd like to invite you and your family to provide a formal statement." Jason's jaw tightened. "Will those officers be present?" "No, sir," the officer replied quickly. "They've been placed on unpaid administrative leave. The department takes these allegations seriously." Jason considered this for a moment. "We'll provide our statement, but I expect transparency. This investigation needs to be thorough." Understood, the officer said. We'll ensure you're kept informed every step of the way. The meeting at the police station was tense but professional. Jason detailed the events of the roadside stop, his tone measured but firm. Natalie spoke next, her voice cracking slightly as she described the fear she felt watching the officers grab Alex and destroy his phone. When it was Brianna's turn, she hesitated, her hands trembling. Jason reached over, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Just tell them the truth," he said softly. Brianna nodded, her voice steadying as she spoke. "They treated us like criminals," she said. "They didn't see us as a family, just as people they could push around." Alex, despite his earlier bravado, struggled to keep his composure. "I was scared," he admitted, "but I didn't want to let them win. That's why I recorded them." The investigator taking their statements nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you for your courage. We'll ensure your account is part of the official record." As the investigation progressed, more troubling details came to light. Internal Affairs uncovered complaints against the same officers from other motorists, many of whom described similar patterns of behavior. The department faced mounting pressure to address not only this incident, but also the broader culture that had allowed such misconduct to flourish. Jason stayed in close contact with his agency, leveraging his connections to ensure the investigation remained fair and transparent. He also worked with civil rights organizations to amplify the issue, participating in interviews and public discussions about the need for police reform. "It's not just about punishing two bad cops," Jason said during one televised interview. "It's about creating a system that holds officers accountable and ensures this doesn't happen to anyone else." One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Jason received a call from a senior official at the Department of Justice. The man's voice was calm but authoritative. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to personally commend you for how you handled this situation. Your actions have sparked a necessary conversation." Jason leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about justice, for my family, and for everyone who's been treated this way." "We agree," the official replied. "That's why we're launching a broader investigation into the practices of the local police department. Your case has highlighted systemic issues that need to be addressed." Jason's chest swelled with a mix of pride and relief. "Thank you. That means a lot." As the days turned into weeks, the Carters began to feel a sense of closure. The officers involved were suspended pending further disciplinary action, and the police department announced plans for mandatory bias training and increased oversight. But for Jason, the fight wasn't over. He continued to advocate for change, using his platform to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced. One evening, as the family sat together watching the sunset, Brianna turned to her father. "Do you think it's enough, what we've done?" Jason smiled faintly. "It's a start," he said. "And sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference." The ripple effect. The days following the viral spread of Alex's video were a whirlwind for the Carter family. Their quiet family road trip had become a catalyst for a national conversation, a flashpoint in the fight for justice. While the public rallied around them, Jason knew the real battle was only beginning. The family sat together in their hotel suite in Santa Fe, the weight of the past weeks still hanging heavily in the air. Jason was on his laptop, his screen filled with emails and news articles. Natalie sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, while Brianna and Alex shared the couch, alternating between reading social media posts and nervously glancing at their father. "They're calling us heroes," Alex said, his voice tinged with both pride and disbelief. "People are saying we stood up to injustice." Jason glanced at his son, his expression thoughtful. "We did what we had to do, Alex. But this isn't about being heroes. It's about holding people accountable." Natalie leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Jason, what happens now? The officers are on leave, but is that enough?" Jason sighed, closing his laptop. "No, it's not. Administrative leave is just the beginning. The investigation will determine if charges are brought against them, but we have to keep the pressure on." Brianna spoke up, her voice quieter than usual. And what if nothing happens? What if they just go back to their jobs like nothing happened? Jason looked at his daughter, his gaze steady. That's not going to happen, Brianna. We've already made it too public. The system can't ignore this anymore. The next morning, Jason received a call from Agent Collins, the internal affairs officer who had initially contacted him. Mr. Carter, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've uncovered a pattern of misconduct involving the 2 officers who stopped your family. There are multiple complaints against them, many of which were swept under the rug. Jason's jaw tightened. And what's being done about it? We're recommending that both officers be terminated and face criminal charges, Collins said. But that's not all. This case has sparked a review of the department's leadership and policies. There's a lot of rot to clean up. Jason leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Keep me informed. This isn't just about those 2 officers. It's about the system that allowed this to happen. Understood, Collins replied. And thank you for your cooperation. Your family's courage has made this possible. Later that day, the Carters attended a community meeting organized by local activists and civil rights organizations. The room was packed with people from all walks of life. Residents of Santa Fe, journalists, and representatives from advocacy groups. Jason was invited to speak, and as he stood at the podium, the room fell silent. My family, and I didn't ask for this fight, Jason began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. We were just a family on a road trip, celebrating my daughter's incredible achievement. But what happened to us that day wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem. A system that allows those in power to abuse it without consequence. He paused, scanning the room. But what we've seen over the past week gives me hope. People are standing up, speaking out, demanding change. And that's how we make a difference, together. The audience erupted into applause, and Jason stepped down, returning to his family. Natalie reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. You were amazing, she whispered. In the days that followed, the Carters became a symbol of resilience and the fight for justice. Their story continued to dominate headlines, sparking debates on cable news and social media. Civil rights organizations used the incident to push for broader police reform, citing the Carters case as a clear example of why systemic change was necessary. But with the spotlight came challenges. Jason received messages of support from across the country, but there were also threats and backlash from those who saw their actions as a challenge to authority. We knew this wouldn't be easy, Jason said one evening as he sat with Natalie. But we can't back down. Natalie nodded, her expression resolute. We won't. Weeks later, the Carters received an invitation to testify before a congressional committee on police accountability. The hearing was televised, and the nation watched as Jason and Natalie recounted their experience, their voices steady and unyielding. This isn't just about my family, Jason said during his testimony. It's about every family that's been harassed, threatened, or dehumanized by those sworn to protect them. We have to do better, as a society and as a nation. The committee members listened intently, and by the end of the hearing, there was little doubt that the Carter story had left an indelible mark. Months later, as the family sat together in their living room back in Austin, the news played on the TV. The officers who had harassed them were convicted of misconduct, and the Santa Fe Police Department announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and the implementation of body cameras. Brianna turned to her father, her eyes shining with pride. We did it, Dad. We made a difference. Jason smiled, pulling his daughter into a hug. We did, and we'll keep fighting for what's right. For the Carters, the road trip had been a detour into danger, but it had also become a journey toward justice, a journey that inspired a nation and reminded them all of the power of resilience, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of what is right. A new dawn. Months had passed since the roadside encounter that changed everything for the Carter family. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the echoes of that day continued to resonate. Jason, Natalie, Brianna, and Alex had become advocates for justice, their voices amplified by a national platform. A family united. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Jason looked around the table at his family. Brianna was animatedly discussing her upcoming move to Stanford, her dreams of becoming a lawyer now fueled by her first-hand experience with injustice. Alex, ever curious, was poring over news articles about civil rights movements, his youthful idealism blending with a newfound sense of purpose. Natalie, calm and supportive as always, prepared plates while humming softly. "I'm proud of all of you," Jason said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Natalie smiled warmly. "We wouldn't have gotten through this without you, Jason. You kept us strong." Jason shook his head. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. We stood together, and that's what made the difference." Brianna leaned forward. "But it's not over, right? There's still so much work to do." Jason nodded. "There always will be. But the key is to keep pushing, to keep holding people accountable. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters." The legacy of change. The reforms in the Santa Fe Police Department were just the beginning. Inspired by the Carter story, other families came forward with their own experiences of injustice. Civil rights organizations launched campaigns to address systemic issues in law enforcement, and Congress passed legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing. Jason was invited to serve as an advisor on national policy initiatives, drawing on his CIA experience to contribute to meaningful reform. Natalie joined a local advocacy group, using her voice to support victims of racial profiling and police misconduct. Brianna's acceptance into Stanford became more than a personal milestone. It was a symbol of resilience and determination. She planned to study law, her goal to fight for the rights of those who couldn't fight for themselves. Alex, inspired by his father's calm authority and his own role in capturing the viral video, began exploring journalism as a way to shine a light on injustice. His broken phone, now replaced, sat on his desk as a reminder of the power of truth. A quiet victory. One afternoon, as Jason sat on the back porch of their home in Austin, Natalie joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over their backyard. "You've been quiet today," Natalie said, handing him a mug. Jason smiled faintly. "Just thinking. It's been a long road." Natalie sat beside him, her gaze soft. "It has. But look at what we've accomplished." Jason nodded. "It's not about the headlines or the recognition. It's about knowing we made a difference, for our kids, for others." Natalie reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "And we did it together." Looking ahead, as the family settled into a new chapter of their lives, they carried with them the lessons of their journey. The road trip that had started as a celebration of Brianna's achievements had turned into something far greater, a fight for justice, a testament to the power of resilience, and a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change is possible. Jason stood in the doorway of their home, watching as Brianna packed her bags for Stanford. Alex was helping her, his enthusiasm infectious. Natalie appeared at his side, slipping her arm around his waist. "They're going to do great things," she said softly. Jason smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "They already have." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Carter family looked forward to a future shaped by hope, determination, and the unwavering belief that together they could overcome anything.